The hay was cut and baled. The well ran clean. The fences along the north pasture were as straight as the day he'd put them in 23 years ago. Corbin Hale was 56 years old, and he had not laughed. Not really laughed. In 4 years, he didn't think about that most days. There was too much to do for thinking. The cattle needed moving before the first frost. The tractor needed a new fuel line. The barn roof had 3 shingles that wouldn't last another winter. He kept a list in the front pocket of his work shirt, written in pencil on the back of a seed catalog page, and he worked through it the way a man works through grief. One item at a time. Head down. No looking up. His spread sat 9 miles east of Harlow, Wyoming, in the kind of country that doesn't apologize for itself. Big sky. Dry's in August. Cottonwoods along the creek that went yellow in October, like something burning slow. His nearest neighbor was 4 miles down the gravel road. He liked it that way. He had liked it that way even when his wife, Donna, was alive. And now that she wasn't, the distance felt less like preference and more like the natural shape of things. He was 56. He told himself that was not old. He also told himself he didn't need the company of anyone in particular. He was better at believing the first thing than the second. The new veterinarian arrived in Harlow on the second Tuesday of September. Corbin found out the way you find out things in a town of 900 people, standing at the feed counter at Heller's Supply while Dale Heller rang up 2 bags of mineral supplement and said, without looking up, here they finally filled the Breckenridge position. Woman from Colorado. Young. Corbin said, Dale said, name's Addie something. Addie Vance, I think. Came up from Fort Collins. Corbin said, again, picked up his bags and drove home. He didn't give it much more thought than that. He had a good vet, old Doc Fenner, who was 71 and had been tending cattle in this county since before Corbin had come to Wyoming. But Doc Fenner's hands had started shaking last spring, and everyone knew it, and no one said anything because there is a particular mercy in pretending not to notice a man's decline when he himself is not ready to name it. The first time Corbin met Adeline Vance, she was elbow-deep in one of his Angus heifers. It was a breech, 3rd week of September, cold enough that his breath made small clouds in the barn, and the heifer had been laboring since before midnight. He'd called the clinic at 4 in the morning because Doc Fenner hadn't answered, and the voice on the other end of the line was awake and steady and said she'd be there in 40 minutes. She was there in 35. She was 28 years old. He didn't know that yet. What he knew was that she came through the barn door with a case in one hand and her hair pulled back under a knit cap, wearing coveralls over what appeared to be pajamas. And she looked at the heifer on the straw and said, "Okay, let's see what we've got," and got to work without another word. Corbin stood back and watched her. He had seen enough calving to know competence when it was in front of him, and what was in front of him was competence. She worked quietly, talking to the heifer in a low murmur that wasn't quite words, and her hands were certain, not fast, but certain. There is a difference. The calf came at 5:40 in the morning, a bull calf, wet and surprised looking, and Adeline sat back on her heels in the straw and let out a breath and said, "There he is." Corbin brought out a towel, an old one he kept for exactly this purpose, and handed it to her without being asked. She looked up at him for the first time, really looked, and said, "Thank you, he said. "That was a close one. It was." She began cleaning up. "He's going to be fine. Keep an eye on her milk production the first few days. Call me if the calf isn't nursing by tomorrow morning." "I will." She snapped her case shut. He walked her out to her truck, a dark green Silverado with Colorado plates she hadn't gotten around to changing yet. The sky was going pale in the east. The cottonwoods along the creek were black silhouettes against it. "I'm Corbin Hale," he said, because he realized he hadn't introduced himself. "Adeline Vance," she said. "Addie's fine." They shook hands in the cold air of early morning. Her grip was firm and brief. She drove away, and Corbin stood in the yard a moment before going back to the barn to check on the heifer and the calf. And he thought, good vet. And that was the whole of it. Or he thought it was. She came back 3 weeks later to do the fall vaccinations. He'd called the clinic and specifically asked for her, which he told himself was purely practical. She already knew his herd. It made sense. He did not examine that reasoning very closely. She arrived on a Wednesday afternoon when the light was low and golden, and everything it touched looked like it might have been worth something. She worked efficiently through the cattle, noting ages, weights, conditions, making observations he filed away because they were useful. She had a habit of explaining her reasoning as she went, not in a lecturing way, but in the way of someone who thought out loud and didn't mind being overheard. When they were done, he offered coffee. He wasn't sure why. He didn't generally offer coffee to people who came to do work on the property. The farrier had been coming for 6 years and had never been offered coffee. Addie looked at the sky, which was going orange along the horizon, and said, "Sure, thank you." They sat at the kitchen table, which was a table he had built himself 20 years ago, from a single plank of Douglas fir. It was not a fancy table. It was a working table, and it showed that. She put her hands around her mug and looked at the grain of the wood and said, "Did you make this?" "I did. It's beautiful." He had heard that before, about the table. People said it. He had stopped really hearing it. But for some reason, when she said it, he heard it. They talked for 45 minutes. About the herd, at first, her recommendations for next year's breeding season, a concern she had about one of his older cows, questions about his grazing rotation. Then, gradually, about other things. She'd grown up in western Kansas. Her father had run a small sheep operation. She'd known she wanted to be a vet since she was 11 years old, and she'd gone straight at that goal the way you go straight at a fence you need to get over. Fort Collins, 4 years. Then a 2-year residency in large animal practice. Then Wyoming, because Wyoming had needed her and she had needed somewhere that felt like the country she'd grown up in. "Do you like it here?" he asked. She considered that honestly, which he noticed. Some people answer questions like that before you're done asking them. "I think so," she said. "Ask me in the spring. I don't know a place until I've been cold in it." He thought that was a good answer. He didn't say so. When she left, he stood in the doorway and watched her taillights disappear down the gravel road, and then he went inside and washed the 2 mugs and set them back in the cabinet and did not think about it anymore. He thought about it for 3 days. Now, friends, I want to stop here for just a moment. If you're new to Prairie Hearts, welcome. We're so glad you found us. And if you've been riding along with us for a while, you know that these are the stories I love most. Not the loud ones, not the complicated ones, the quiet ones. The ones where something small happens in a kitchen, or a barn, or a gravel driveway at dusk, and nothing is ever quite the same after. I'd love to know, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from today? Drop your city, your state, your country in the comments below. And if this story is speaking to you, leave us a like. It means more than you know. It tells us to keep going. Now, let's get back to Corbin. Because things are about to get a little complicated. She came for the older cow in November. The one Corbin had been watching, the one Addie had flagged in October. The animal had gone off of her feed, and Corbin had called the clinic before full light that morning because the cow was 14 years old, and he had raised her from a calf and did not intend to lose her without a fight. Addie arrived by 8. She was wearing her good coat this time, heavy canvas with a fleece collar, and she moved through the cold with the quick efficiency of someone who had been in cold barns her whole life and had made a private peace with it. She worked for an hour and a half. It was hardware disease, a piece of wire the cow had ingested, working its way through. Treatable if caught. She'd caught it. Corbin made coffee while she worked, and when it was over and they were standing in the barn doorway watching the cow settle, he handed her a thermos and said, "Thank you." "That's my job," she said, but she took the thermos still. She drank the coffee. He stood beside her, 2 or 3 feet of winter air between them, and they both watched the cow for a while the way you watch something that has come close to being lost and is for now still there. "She might have another 2 years, Addie said. "Maybe 3, if this winter's mild. I know. You've had her a long time." "Since she was 3 days old," he said. "Her mama died, and I bottle-fed her in the kitchen. My wife thought I'd lost my mind." He didn't say much about Donna. He said almost nothing about Donna to almost anyone. He wasn't sure why he said it then. Addie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long ago was that?" 4 years, he said. "The wife. The cow's been here 14. I'm sorry." "Thank you." They stood there a while longer. She handed him back the thermos. She pulled her gloves on to drive, and she said, "She'll want soft feed for a few weeks, and call me if anything changes." "I will." She drove away. He went back in the barn and scratched the cow behind the ears and said quietly, to no one, "Close call, old girl." He didn't know if he meant the cow. December brought the snow. It came early that year, which in Wyoming means it came the first week of December instead of the last week of November, and it stayed. Corbin moved through the winter routines the way he had moved through them for 20 years, feeding at first light, checking water, watching the sky, calculating. The days were short. The work was long. He slept well, which was something he had not always been able to say. Addie called once, in mid-December, to check on the cow. He answered on the second ring, and they talked for 12 minutes, and when she said goodbye, he stood in the kitchen holding the phone for a moment before setting it on the counter. He was 56 years old. He had been 56 for 4 months. He would be 57 in February, and 57 felt, for reasons he couldn't precisely name, like a number that meant something. Like a door you could still open from one side or the other, depending on which side you were standing on. He did not think he was the kind of man who had these thoughts. Apparently he was. She came back in January when his quarter horse, a 17-year-old bay gelding named Captain who had been with him since the animal was 4, began favoring his left foreleg. Corbin had noticed it the way you notice something about an old friend. Not all at once, but in small accretions of concern, one morning and then another, until the concern had mass. Addie examined the leg with her hands, methodical and gentle, and the horse stood quietly for her the way horses sometimes stand for people they decide to trust. "Navicular changes," she said. "He's had this a while." "I know, you've been managing it." "Best I could." She looked at the horse. She looked at Corbin. She said, "He's comfortable. Keep doing what you're doing. Specialized shoeing would help. And butte before you ride him, if you ride him. I mostly just let him be these days." She nodded. She understood that. He could see she understood it, and that understanding, that small recognition, did something to the air between them. They ended up in the kitchen again. It happened naturally, without discussion, as if there were an established routine to it. Coffee, the plank table, the light from the window. Outside, the fields were white, and the sky was white, and it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. He asked her how her first Wyoming winter was treating her. "Cold," she said, "but," she smiled. It was the first time he'd seen her smile, fully unguarded. She was 28 years old, and when she smiled, she looked, briefly, like the 11-year-old girl who had decided she was going to spend her life helping animals and had gone straight at that intention like a fence to get over. "But I like it," she said. "It's honest. The cold doesn't pretend." He thought about that for a moment. He said, "No, it doesn't." "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked, not as a challenge, out of genuine curiosity. "No," he said without hesitation. "Why not?" He looked out the window, the white fields, the black line of the fence, the far cottonwoods, bare and gray in the winter light. "Because this is the place that fits," he said, "even when it's hard. A place that fits is worth staying in." She was quiet, turning her mug slowly in her hands. Then she said, "I hope I find that." "I think you might already be in it," he said. She looked at him, a long look, steady and a little surprised. Then she looked back at her coffee. He realized, somewhere in the quiet that followed, that he was in trouble, not the bad kind, the other kind, the kind that arrives without announcing itself and sits down at your kitchen table and drinks your coffee and looks at the grain of your Douglas fir and says that is beautiful and means it. He was 56. She was, he had found out, in the way you find things out in a town of 900. 28. 28 years old. 28 years younger than him. He had boots older than some of the friendships she'd made in this life. He was old enough to be her father, near enough, and he was not a man who let himself want things he had no business wanting. He was also, it turned out, a man who was not as good at not wanting things as he'd believed. His birthday month. He turned 57 on a Thursday. He did not tell anyone. He ate breakfast alone, fed the cattle in the cold, came inside and made soup from a can, and thought, 57. Well, Addie called that afternoon about a prescription he'd needed for the old cow, a follow-up from January. He answered and she asked after the animal, and he told her the animal was doing well, and she said she was glad. And then there was a pause in the conversation that lasted a beat too long. And he said, "It's my birthday today," which he had not intended to say at all. She said, "Today? Today? Are you doing anything?" "I had soup." A pause. And then quietly, something he couldn't quite identify in her voice, not quite laughter, but close to it. "Well, happy birthday, Corbin." "Thank you," he said. After he hung up, he sat in the kitchen for a while. He put his hands flat on the Douglas fir table. He looked at his hands. The knuckles, the calluses, the particular arrangement of age and work that hands take on when they have been doing hard things in cold weather for several decades. These were not young hands. He thought about what it meant to want something you were too old for. He thought about Donna, who had loved him when he was young and had gone on loving him as he stopped being young, and who had understood something about him that he was still understanding about himself. He thought about a 28-year-old woman with her hair pulled back under a knit cap, elbow-deep in a heifer at 5 in the morning, saying, "There he is," with a quiet satisfaction that had nothing in it of performance. He sat there until the light outside went gray, and then he washed his soup pot and went to bed. She called in late March to schedule spring vaccinations. They fixed on a date. He said he'd see her then. He saw her sooner. She came by on a Sunday afternoon that he hadn't expected her, and she pulled up in the green Silverado. Wyoming plates now, he noticed, and got out carrying a small container with a lid on it. She walked up to the door and she knocked. He opened the door. She held out the container. "I made a cake," she said, "for your birthday. I know it's late. I almost didn't come. But it seemed wrong not to." He looked at the container. He looked at her. He said, "You made a cake." "Chocolate, with pecans. I asked Dale at the feed store what you liked, and he said you used to order the pecan pie at the diner every Friday before the diner closed, so I went with pecans." She paused. "I realize that's a strange thing to have done. The Dale part. You can say so?" "Come inside," he said. She came inside. He put coffee on. She took the lid off the cake, and it was, in fact, a chocolate cake with pecans, and it looked like someone had made it with care and not a great deal of formal training, which made it better somehow. They ate cake at the table. Outside, the last of the winter was breaking up, the fields going from white to brown to something that wasn't quite green yet but was thinking about it. March in Wyoming is not spring, but it is the beginning of the thought of spring, which is its own kind of thing. He watched her eat cake, and he thought, she drove out here on a Sunday afternoon to bring a man she barely knows a birthday cake. 6 weeks after his birthday. He thought, that is not a professional courtesy. He thought, you are 57 years old, Corbin Hale, and you are going to make a fool of yourself. He thought about it for 3 days after she left. He thought about it when he was feeding the cattle, and when he was fixing the fuel line, and when he was lying in the dark at 4 in the morning listening to the wind come across the north pasture. And then he called her. Not the clinic, her cell phone, which she had given him for after-hours emergencies. This was not an after-hours emergency. She answered on the second ring. He said, "I'd like to take you to dinner, if you're willing." A silence, not a long one. "Corbin," she said. Then she stopped. "I know," he said. "I don't think you do," she said. "I don't think you know what I was about to say." He waited. She said, "I was going to say yes." He was 57 years old. He held the phone and looked at his hands on the table and thought with some surprise that he had not felt like this in a very long time. Like something had been added back that he hadn't known was missing. Like the air had a particular quality to it that it hadn't had before. "Saturday," he said. "Saturday," she said. It was not a simple thing. He knew it wasn't. She was 28 and he was 57, and there was a town of 900 people who would notice, because 900 people always notice, and he was not a man who was accustomed to being the subject of other people's conversation. He sat with the discomfort of that. He sat with the arithmetic of it, the years between them, the years ahead of them, the plain fact of his own age in any light you chose to examine it. He sat with it for 2 days, and then he called her back. "I need to say something," he said. "All right. I am 57 years old. I'm going to be 60 in 3 years. I have a 17-year-old horse and a 14-year-old cow and a tractor that gives me trouble and a body that does the same more often than I'd like. I'm set in my ways, which are a rancher's ways. I get up at 4:30. I go to bed at 9. I don't go much of anywhere. I've been doing this my whole life, and I'm not going to stop. That is the honest account of what you'd be walking into, and I think you deserve to have it plain." A pause. She said, "Are you done?" "I think so." "Good," she said, "because I'm going to say something now, and I need you to listen." He listened. "I grew up watching my father do exactly what you just described," she said. 4:30, 9 o'clock, the same land, the same work, the same hard winters. My father is the best man I know, and I am telling you right now that what you just described to me does not sound like a warning. It sounds like a life. It sounds like the kind of life I came to Wyoming to be near." He was quiet. She said, "I'm 28, Corbin." "Not 20. I know what I'm looking at. And what I'm looking at isn't old. What I'm looking at is steady. Those are different things." He sat in the silence of that for a long moment. Then he said, "Saturday, Saturday," she said. And he could hear in her voice that she was smiling. They went to Millbrook, which was the next town over, and had a restaurant that wasn't a diner, and had tablecloths which felt right for the occasion. He wore his good shirt and his clean hat, and he arrived 4 minutes before she did, which was intentional. When she came in the door, he stood up, the way he'd been raised too, and she was wearing a dress the color of pine trees, and her hair was down, and she looked across the restaurant and found him, and she smiled, and he sat back down, slowly because his knees were doing something he preferred not to dignify. They talked for 3 hours. The restaurant staff refilled their water and brought bread, and eventually stopped hovering. They talked the way 2 people talk when they've been talking around something for 6 months and have finally arrived at the thing itself. Which is to say, easily, with relief, with the occasional silence that was not uncomfortable. He told her about building the table, the plank he'd found at a mill outside Cody, the 2 weeks it had taken, Donna sitting at the finished table and saying, "Well, I'm glad you found something you can't fix by working harder at it." She told him about her first year of vet school, the homesickness, the cold anatomy lab, the moment she'd delivered her first calf alone at 2 in the morning and called her father from the parking lot. Afterward, she had to tell someone, and there was only one someone she wanted to tell. He told her about the morning his son, who lived in Colorado now and called on birthdays and Christmas, had called the February after Donna died and said, "Dad, I think you should sell the ranch and come down here," and how he'd stood in the kitchen and felt, for the first and only time, a flash of something close to anger, because the ranch was not a thing you sold. It was a thing you were. She listened to that without saying anything. Then she said, "He doesn't understand." "No," Corbin said. "He doesn't. But you're still glad he called." He thought about it. "Yes," he said, "I am." On the drive home, he had followed her to town in his truck and would follow her back. The sky was enormous and very clear, and the stars were the particular stars of a Wyoming February night, which more stars than most people have seen or will see in their lives. He rolled the window down a little, just enough to feel the cold air. When they reached the turnoff to her rental on Callow Road, he pulled up behind her. They both got out. They stood in the cold between their two trucks, with the night enormous around them. She said, "Thank you, Corbin." "Thank you," he said. She looked up at the sky for a moment, then at him. Her eyes in the starlight were steady and clear, and she said, "I know you're going to go home and find 15 reasons that this is a bad idea. I just want you to know that I've already looked at all of them, and I'm still here." He stood with that. He stood with the cold and the stars and the particular weight of 57 years of a life lived carefully, and he said, "I know." She said, "Okay." He said, "Okay." She went inside. He drove the 9 miles home on the dark gravel road, and the sky was very big, and the fields were silver with frost, and he thought, a place that fits is worth staying in. He thought, some things you don't choose. You just come out of the cold and find them waiting. He was 57 years old. He felt, for the first time in 4 years, not young. Not young, just present, just here. Just in the one life he had, which was, it turned out, still going. There is a thing about love when it comes late, or when it comes to someone who has told himself it would not come again. It doesn't announce itself the way it does when you're young. It doesn't arrive at a run. It arrives the way the first good day of spring arrives in Wyoming, which is quietly and when you're not watching, and you step outside in the morning and you think, the air is different. Something has changed, and you stand there for a moment, just standing, before you can name what it is. That is how it came to Corbin Hale, quietly. Between a barn and a kitchen table and a birthday cake brought 6 weeks late by a 28-year-old woman who had looked at everything he was afraid to show her and said, "That doesn't look like a warning. That looks like a life." He was 57 years old, and his life was not, as he had quietly believed for 4 years without ever quite saying so, behind him. It was here, right here. Standing in the starlight on Callow Road with Wyoming spread out in every direction, cold and clear and honest, the way good things are. Friends, I want to thank you for spending this time with Corbin and Addie. Stories like this one, the quiet ones, the unhurried ones, the ones where love doesn't knock down a door but instead knocks politely and waits. These are the stories I believe in. Because I think most of us know that the big dramatic things are not, in the end, where life lives. Life lives in the grain of a Douglas fir table, in a cup of coffee handed over without being asked, in a woman who drives 9 miles on a Sunday afternoon with a chocolate pecan cake and says, "I almost didn't come, but it seemed wrong not to." That is where it lives. If this story found you today, I hope it gave you something to carry. I hope it reminded you that steady is not the same as old, that quiet is not the same as empty, and that a place that fits, whether that place is land or work or a person, is worth staying in. God bless you, wherever you're listening from. Take care of the people around you. Take care of the animals in your keeping. And as we always say here at Prairie Hearts, keep riding. There's more country ahead than you think.